Okay, hello everyone. My name is Maysa Thani and I'm the Managing Director of USQBC Doha office. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Business Communication During Disruptive Periods. Thank you for taking time out and being here today. Now I'm going to give the floor to our moderator, Dr. June Rest. Dr. Rest.
Thank you, Ms. Thani, and welcome to our audience today. We're delighted to be here. I'm pleased to be with three colleagues and friends on the panel today who are all experts in the business of communication. These are the leaders in the field who organizations turn to when they need counsel and they need expertise on how to craft and deliver messages that reach their intended stakeholders with the desired impact. All of these folks serve on the University of Virginia's Darden Leadership Council, where they work with the leadership communication faculty in ensuring that our curriculum is current and that students graduate with the knowledge and skills needed to lead organizations. Now more than ever, our graduate business students must be skilled in communicating during times of disruption and transformation, and I can think of no better group of men than the three that are with us today to help us with that. Let me introduce the panel to you briefly. Mr. Ken Askew, say hi, Ken, who has worked in political, corporate, small business, and agency environments for many years, with emphasis on executive communication. He was senior White House speechwriter for President George Herbert Walker Bush and chief communicator for United States Senator Sam Nunn, who was chairman at the time of the Armed Services Commission. Ken also was head of executive communication for Pfizer Pharmaceuticals and director of strategic communication programs for Michael Milken. Ken currently is head of executive communication for the Americas at MUFG, the world's largest bank outside China, with a staggering $3 trillion in assets. So welcome, Ken, to the panel. Mr. Tim Beecher. Mr. Beecher brings more than 30 years of experience as an expert in crisis and labor communication. He most recently was the senior partner at Fleishman Hillard, where he helped create and build the public relations agency elite global community of certified crisis management counselors. He has guided clients through crisis response and reputation recovery programs when they have experienced all types of disruption. I'm only going to say a few, Ken, because you hit the gamut on this one. Natural disasters, environmental cleanups, discrimination claims, executive dismissals, hostile takeovers, industrial accidents, and management and labor disputes, among others. So I think we'll have some insight from Mr. Beecher. And lastly, but not lastly, Steve Soltis, who recently retired from the Coca-Cola Company, where he led executive and internal communications and served as a lead communication strategist for Chairman and CEO Muhtar Kent, who is now retired. In addition, Steve also led executive communication efforts for 10 years at UPS, the world's largest transportation company. And today he is affectionately known as the CEO Whisperer, as he now consults with the C-suite of several Fortune 50 corporations. So welcome, panelists, today, and thank you for agreeing to join us. So let's get started. Tim Beecher worked for many decades with corporations who found themselves embroiled in lots of interesting crisis situations. You recently gave an industry talk entitled Tales from the Front Lines. Will you share some of those stories with us and provide some insight on companies and their leaders who were successful and those who just never got it right? Tim?
June, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and good morning and good evening to all of our participants. It's an honor to be with you today and to have this opportunity to speak about crisis. First of all, I think I speak for all of us on the panel that we hope that you and your families are healthy and well in this unforeseen and unprecedented crisis that we find ourselves in. And it is the topic of the day, and well, it sounds trite to say what we are experiencing is not just as a nation, but as a civilization is without precedent, at least in my lifetime, and I expect in yours as well. As a veteran of the Vietnam War and the Cold War, and someone who has endured multiple recessions and, as June pointed out, multiple crises, The challenges of COVID-19 are global, not just national. And it's a pandemic that has the power to grow exponentially, and certainly nothing we've experienced and hope we never have to experience again. The only comparable crises would be the global military conflicts of the 30s and 40s in the last century. But I have, however, worked with CEOs and other executives on crises that can be seen as existential, once-in-a-lifetime events. These are crises that had the potential to force the business to close forever. And so what I'd like to bring to the conversation today is my experience in helping business leaders understand how communications plays an essential role in responding to crisis. One key element in dealing with crisis is how the company or the organization relates to three primary audiences or stakeholder groups. Understanding the nature of these relationships, that is, what each party expects of the other, what their knowledge is of each other, and how they have communicated in the past, this will inform how to respond to those groups in a crisis. As Peter Drucker said, public relations is shorthand for public relationships, and there is an implied two-way connection that needs to be respected. The three primary audiences that I refer to are investors, customers, and employees. Certainly there are other stakeholders, but these are at the core. Each audience brings capital to the organization. Investors and customers bring money or financial capital. Employees bring their work ethic and energy that moves the enterprise forward. You know, COVID-19 is a crisis for business because it threatens capital. Company leaders often react to that reality with a drive to preserve capital. Witness how airlines, hotels, rental car agencies, and others have been shrinking capacity as quickly as possible, idling physical assets because they want to preserve cash. You know the old proverb, cash is king, and when you're out of cash, you're out of business. So the rush to conserve cash and financial capital is typical and a time-tested response to crises like this one. But what about that human capital? Doesn't that need to be preserved? I argue that in this crisis, human capital is as important and maybe more important than cash. Prior to COVID-19, here in the US at least, we were at near full employment. Everyone who wanted a job had a job. With the coronavirus, we are seeing unemployment now in the low double digits, a change that took less than 60 days. It may get worse. All of us know there will be an end to this crisis. Social distancing, washing our hands, etc. There are very smart people trying to find a vaccine for this virus. There will be a brighter and more hopeful tomorrow. What kinds of companies will attract and retain the best employees when that happens? I submit that those using communications to reflect their commitment to protecting human capital will win those races for talent. They are the companies protective of their brands and reputations that are also demonstrating an empathy and protection for their employees as well. Leaders making personal financial sacrifices and doing what they can to support and protect their now displaced human capital will fare better than those that do not when this crisis passes. Finally, that means communicating first with internal audiences, the employees, and then building on that messaging for use with external audiences. Always a good idea to communicate inside the organization first and then reinforce those messages using external media. So June, that's a long answer to a short question, but I hope that gets us started down the path on our panel today.
Very well done, Tim. Yes, of course it did. It got us to the question of what kind of corporations will maintain their employees, as you said, and who will protect their images and brands and reputations. So it's a good way to get us kicked off. Let's turn then to Ken Askew, beaming in from the Marin County, California. Ken, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, you are laser focused on your bank's employees, just as Tim said, first employees, then customers. Can you share with us some of your strategy on engaging and inspiring employees and the SWAT team that you assembled to work with you worldwide?
Hi, yeah, thanks, June, and hello, everyone. Thanks for this invitation to join you today. And again, let me echo Tim that I hope everybody is well and safe. Obviously, we're living in an entire library of future case studies, and the situation is enormously complex. So let me just highlight a few simple things we've been doing. And essentially, our approach has been built around leadership credibility. I'm not a big fan of military analogies, but this is something, credibility is something you have to build in peacetime. So you can't just, going into battle is not the time to try to ask for credibility. When a crisis comes along, it's possible to apply a basic playbook and scramble to put communication strategies into place, but you can't instantly manufacture a voice that's immediately is accepted as authentic. It has to be established well in advance as a pattern of your communication strategy day in and day out. At NUFG, we're fortunate in at least two ways. First, our CEO takes his job as communicator-in-chief extremely seriously and always has. So he has established credibility. He says it's his most important job. And Steve, you may remember we were at a conference recently where the CEO of UPS was asked what percentage of your job is communication, and he said 100%. So he said, everything I do and say, every gesture I make, everything communicates a message of some sort. So that's pretty much the way our CEO looks at it too. He has earned the ability to lead out loud, so to speak. And the second thing that we're lucky about is our culture has proven itself to be authentic. It's true what they say, a crisis will expose the real you. Unfortunately, in our case, we've got a couple of things going for us. One is the Japanese culture, and the other is community banking, which is part of our business, not all of our business, but both of those instilled a natural sense of teamwork, and it's a very strong part of our culture, and it came to the fore in this crisis. What we did, just to put it simply, we shared consistent messages when this crisis broke at three internal levels. I'm just going to talk about internal communications. And the CEO's voice has been clear on all three. First was to the executive committee, about a dozen top officers, very disciplined approach in meeting daily, actually several times a day with his dozen top officers. Then the senior leadership team, the next layer down, our top 250 senior managers throughout the Americas. And again, the CEO directly communicated with them, plus the executive committee cascaded messages as well. And then finally, the community, we have 11,000 colleagues in the US, Canada, and Latin America. So those are the three layers that the CEO reached out to on a regular basis directly, and there was a cascading mechanism in place. We kept it very simple. In the heat of the moment, you have to keep it simple. There's so much complexity with business continuity plans and disaster recovery plans and so forth going on. It reminds me of the old saying, if you chase two rabbits, both will escape. So you just got to focus on one thing at a time. So lessons that we learned over the last few weeks was lesson one, straight out of the gate. We communicated what we could, when we could, as directly as we could. We did not vacillate, apologize, or be evasive in any way, shape, or form. Lesson two, we tried to bundle messages as best as possible. During a situation like this, the desire to communicate is overwhelming. Every nook and cranny of the organization has a need to get information out to its constituencies. And sometimes very often those constituencies overlap. So there's sort of a matrix of communication, and it gets very complicated very easily. So someone has to play air traffic control and make sure in the rush to relay information, you don't flood the zone too much. You run the risk of confusing people and they can tune you out. Lesson three, once things settled down and our hair wasn't on fire anymore, we gave employees a platform to connect with each other and connect about something other than the crisis, something light. Humans need distractions, and we naturally hunger for social connection. And this is magnified when you're suddenly stuck at home or an unfamiliar remote workplace or quarantine. People need people, and you can't discount that. Don't ever discount that. And finally, something that media trainers and speech coaches have been saying for 100 years, bring yourself into the story. We brought ourselves into the story. Our leaders use the I pronoun. executives talked about personal experience. Case in point, when our CEO rented a car and drove 500 miles from New York to isolate with his family in another state, he set up shop in a room that was too bright for his webcam, so he stapled an old shower curtain behind him to block the light coming through the window. And his exercise bike was in the background covered with clothes. But very human, very real, very relatable. A lot of us could relate to the bicycle covered with clothes. It's okay to talk about your kids, your pets, your exercise schedule. People can sense authenticity in a heartbeat, and credibility rises, and you get what we clinically describe in management terms as alignment, and people need that. So those are some just really quick, simple takeaways, and I look forward to your questions. Back over to you, June.
All right, thank you very much. 4 very good points for all of us to take into account. Particularly enjoyed the issue of credibility. I talk to my students a lot about the importance of credibility as a sender of a message, both as an organization and as an individual. Let's now turn to Steve Soltis. Steve, your focus has been on leadership communication, and you are just the importance of strong communication planning, cadence, and consistency in the messages coming out of the C-suite, as both Tim and Ken have underscored. Since we're now at the heart of earnings season and annual shareholder meeting season, what are you seeing at the moment in earnings scripts and outreach to the investor communities?
Sure, thanks, June, and thanks my fellow panelists and folks who are participating in the webinar today. Really appreciate your time and attention. I look forward to your questions here in a bit as well. June, I think there's basically 5 themes that I'm seeing that I'm both helping write in earnings scripts, as well as what I'm listening to and responding to from the clients that I work with. And they touch on areas that both Tim and Ken artfully described, but I think it really starts with, I think Tim really hit it home. It starts with, every script I've read starts with what we're doing to ensure the continued safety and well-being of our people, job one. And that's absolutely critical. That's something, to be very honest, you don't hear typically in earnings calls and press release scripts that are press releases around earnings. The people component is typically delegated towards the end of the script, if at all. So what we're really seeing is a concentrated effort to show the actions that brands are taking to really take care of their people. And I think investors see that as fundamental to business continuity, because this is the last time, this would be the worst time, I should say, for employees to feel like they're out of the loop and they're just no longer engaged. We need employee engagement today more than we've ever needed it for business continuity, and investors get that. So that's the first theme. And then followed closely to that is the customer piece, which Tim and Ken both also touched on, which is making sure that we're doing everything in our power to continue to serve customers as best we can during these crazy times. So that's another major theme. And then the third, again, we've talked about, is cash flow, ensuring that we've got business continuity planning and operations and contingency planning in place that's going to ensure a viable, or at least semi-viable, economic model through these next few weeks, as it's going to become increasingly difficult to operate. So that cash flow piece and demonstrating how we're generating cash flow is a theme we're seeing in a lot of the messaging right now. The fourth theme, which is really how do we, as Ken mentioned, we are in the midst of the most compressed and dynamic, fluid case study in business operation history and management and brand and reputation history that we've seen, at least in our lifetimes. And so a lot of the messaging is how do we adapt this learning and some of the innovations. There's been some tremendous innovations that have come out of business and other organizations over the last few weeks. How do we integrate that into our operating model moving forward? And then fifth is sort of, okay, what's our plan to restart? This is, as Ken mentioned, as Tim mentioned, these dark days will pass. And then what is the plan once we get out of this to really reignite and restart the business and get it moving, not only on, 8 cylinders, but 22 cylinders. So that's, investors want to see a plan. I think they're giving everybody obviously a hall pass. There's a lot of empathy around. We know there's a lot of disruption with people in business and customer accountability, but what is your plan moving forward? And that's obviously a big theme in all the scripts that we're seeing at the moment.
Let's hope that we get there soon and safely to be able to reset. Thank you, panelists. Amanda, do we have some questions perhaps from our audience at this point?
Yes, there is one question so far for Ken. I'm just going to read it out loud. So how can the communications matrix be maintained when people in various departments are eager to communicate with clients immediately? What is an effective process or model? Great
question. I know everybody always says that's a great question. This actually is a great question. In our case, it's been very maintaining connection with the key people in your organization, and by that I mean I guess every day I have probably at least 4 meetings that are scheduled. They're scheduled for 30 minutes. We try to keep them to 5 or 10 minutes instead, and usually successful. We touch base with everybody who is an interested party in communicating to their particular constituency. And we just check in with everybody. We all, that's why I said earlier, we have air traffic control. We need air traffic control. And in our case, there's one person who basically oversees everything. She's our top communications person. And we have on various calls, we have legal, we have the compliance people, the risk people, the line of business, human resources. Each particular little, what June described earlier as SWAT teams, is these little task forces. We keep them small. I don't think any of these calls have more than like 5 or 6 people. And we touch base pretty much every single day. And just make sure we know what's going on with everybody so that we don't repeat messages, we don't send conflicting messages. And you fly by the seat of your pants, but if you keep the meeting small and you get the right people there, you don't overcomplicate things, and you just make sure who else needs to know this? Who else needs to know this? And I think that's the way you keep people from flying off into their silos.
Amanda, is there any other questions?
Anybody else have any questions? Perhaps put it in the chat, or I've got more.
Amanda, it's Tim, and I would just amplify what Ken said, and it really does need to be emphasized that what I would call setting a big table for discussion about messaging has been incredibly high impact for CEOs that we've worked with in the past. That is, when you bring not only senior leadership, but operations, marketing, HR, finance, communications certainly, to the table at one time to problem solve and develop messages and talk about audiences. It's by far the most efficient and effective way to communicate. As a boss of mine once announced to a group, public relations is far too important to be the responsibility of the PR department. It's all our responsibility. And I've kept that motto with me for many, many years.
Yeah,
Ken, can you talk to us a little bit more about the cascading information? How important it is to cascade down from the C-suite, Steve and Tim, you as well, so that when the messages reach let's say for UPS, when they reach the wonderful man that comes to my door with my packages, that it's exactly what was set by the corporate strategy communication team.
Mm-hmm. Were you directing that to me or Steve?
Ken, how about you first and then Steve?
Okay.
Sure.
I think consistency and simplicity are the 2 things that you keep in mind when you're cascading messages. And in our case, I described our CEO is directly in contact with all three levels that I described. The first is executive committee on a constant, several times a day basis. And then the next layer down is what we call the SLT, the senior leadership team, the top 250 people. He has SLT calls, conference calls every week, starting off Monday. He also, every Monday posts a little selfie video, 3 minutes to everybody in the organization. So he's in direct contact with all three, but he can't carry all the water himself. So he is expecting his ECA to his executive committees of the Americas to cascade what consistent messages very simply down through their ranks, and then is in a classic cascading matrix style. The main thing is to be consistent and not to overload with information.
Good point. Thank you, Ken. How about Steve? You want to come in on that?
Yeah, I think to pick up on Tim's earlier point and Ken's earlier point about those gatekeepers, and then specifically drilling down into cascading, I think any communication event or campaign, I think we need to look at all of these, especially now as we're developing communication strategies, as we're in the middle of this pandemic, and then thinking about how we're going to communicate post-pandemic. We've got to think holistically, and really starting with basic discussions like Tim, get the CEO, get the senior leadership around a table and say, okay, there's some obvious table stake things we need to do. We need to, keep our employees and our customers and investors and other stakeholders informed of what we're doing. That's table stakes. We know that. We got to do that. We got to be best in the world at doing that. But are there some other sort of what we call hidden X objectives here, is that we could actually, if we execute a communication plan well during this time, what are the implications that could have for our brand, for our reputation, for brand love, for purchase intent, for employee engagement, for morale, for recruiting? I mean, I think a lot of people seeing some fantastic PSAs and other communication coming out from companies right now that get right to the heart of the psyche of the millennials and the kinds of companies they want to work for and be engaged in. I think Tim really set that up earlier when he talked about, being at the heart of the human spirit. So really taking a step back and thinking, what do we want to achieve here? And then crafting that narrative. What is the story that we're going to tell for the next, 6, 7, 8 weeks? What is that story? Who are those audiences? What's their current mindset? What are customers thinking right now? What are employees thinking right now? What are business partners, supply chain partners thinking right now? What are investors thinking right now? And where do we want to take them? What's that desired mindset? So looking at that current mindset, looking at that desired mindset, and then that will help you architect. And I think this gets back to the question that was posed to Ken too, is how do you control the flow and the air traffic controlling? Once you have that audience analysis down, you have a story down, then you start thinking about, okay, who are our best messengers? Sometimes it will be the CEO, sometimes it should be the CEO and, chief customer officer, chief branding officer, chief communication officer, et cetera. Human resources officers should also probably have a role in this. So identifying the right messengers, and then that will help architect what are those specific routines and cadences that we want to start deploying over a set time period, and really laying it out with that kind of discipline and rigor where you've really got everything architected on a page or 2 pages that will get the entire team aligned. And then, of course, everything being set up with some guiding principles. And the guiding principles could be as simple as, and Tim mentioned this earlier, it's got to be, everything's got to be filtered through our employees first. They don't want to hear about something coming, some big initiative or planned layoff or new operating model or structural regime coming through, reading it in the Wall Street Journal. They got to hear it first from senior leadership. So I think you got to really think holistically about that planning.
Yeah, the academic research has shown for years that employees want to hear from their direct supervisors. They want to hear from the CEO, of course, first. But then when we have information to get out to our employees, we want to hear it from the person that we we trust the most, and that's our direct supervisor. Amanda, I see we have a really good question here.
Oh, great. So you can see the question.
Yeah, and Tim, this is a good one. How do you ensure communications discipline during a time like this, particularly with investors and with the press? Do you prohibit staff from talking to the press? Who would like to take that one? Tim, you want to start?
Yeah, I can start with that. And
That's
I think
a great question.
it is. It really is. And Ken pointed out earlier that, you know, there's a difference between your time you have to prepare for a crisis and when you're actually in the crisis. You know, the best practices at companies about dealing with investors and the press have policies and protocols in place about who is authorized to do that, if only because it is an important step in protecting the brand, protecting the organization's reputation, and speaking with one voice for an entire organization. There does need to be some structure around that. Certainly people can speak for themselves about their own personal stories to the media. Nobody wants to inhibit that. But when it comes to the organization, there are some organizational needs and expectations that need to be met. And that's why centralized communications is so important in crisis. I would also say in crisis, we have found that people can absorb somewhere between 2 and 4 major themes or key messages. It's a time when you really do need to be very disciplined in how much people can really understand and absorb in crisis. And you need to keep it, as Ken said, simple, and you need to be consistent and persistent in order to really deliver those messages effectively.
Yeah, Tim, I would just pick up on your point about media. Let's also think about traditional media, broadcast media, print, you know, the major pubs, et cetera, but also consider social media do's and don'ts during this particular time. We got a lot of people at home. Some of them have more time on their hands than others. Social media is probably busier today than it's been in the history of that young art form, if you will, that young media form. And I think it's not too late if you don't have social media guidelines published and distributed to all employees. It's not too late. You should get those things drafted quickly and distributed to all your employees so that they are. You certainly want to, there's absolutely nothing wrong with employees, especially during this time, expressing personality traits and experiences that enhance brand love and are emotional and fit in with the brand. But you also don't want people going off the reservation, if you will, and saying political things necessarily, or personal things, or demonstrating themselves in a less than professional way. Especially during these times, we've seen that happen, and it's not only career limiting, but it's brand damaging. So establishing clear social media guidelines, I think, is absolutely critical.
We have another wonderful question. With such a global crisis, communications about the situation is no longer exclusive to the local markets or the limited corporate market employees are across the globe being affected. How can corporations manage that kind of communication? And more embellishment here. In some countries, such crisis does not only mean losing your jobs, but could also mean losing your legal status, your place of residence, and this can create a major impact on the psychology of employees. And how can that be managed? The worldwide impact.
Well, it's a really important point. I would, on the first part of that, what we haven't touched on, especially as we've said, this is a global crisis and one that crosses borders without any regard for borders. Understanding national cultures in communications is essential. We had a client a couple of years ago that didn't fully understand the culture in France, for example, and the legacy about a sensitivity around surveillance post-World War II, a sensitivity that had extended well into the 90s and 2000s. And in the United States, when whistleblower protections became very important and a number of companies just rolled out hotlines, these 1-800 numbers that would go to a third party. We had a global client that rolled it out throughout the organization internationally. And when that landed in France, the whole issue of a 1-800 number and surveillance from a culture that was deeply touched by the things that happened 40 or 50 or 60 years prior caused an incredible uproar. So having a very good eye and ear for cultural sensitivities and how these things are communicated is incredibly important, because it does change from country to country. So I would say that that is an important point in this discussion. For those that lose their positions and how companies relate to that, as I mentioned earlier, I think no matter what the stature of the person is in the organization, if the organization from a leadership perspective can communicate in ways that says, you still are important to us, we recognize your humanity, and we will do what we can to ease the pain of this problem, I think we'll go a long way towards protecting the organization's long-term interest.
Yeah, just to pick up on Tim's point, the cultural nuances are critical, and even within a monoculture, if you will, or a multicultural like the United States, we have different perspectives, right? We have some employees who feel, who feel a certain way about political issues and home measures, as we're seeing with protests around the United States, and then we have other employees who have a completely different point of view, and you've got to somehow thread the needle on that as much as possible without alienating people at this time. One of the things that we did at the Coca-Cola Company, I think that helped quite a bit in issues like this is we had what we call our communications freedom within a framework. So we established sort of a global messaging, if you will, and global priorities and objectives and planning, but we gave the local markets the freedom to tailor that messaging to local nuance. So, there were certain things that we would say in the US to our people to announce a new initiative or to convey bad news, if you will, that to the point, I think, of the person asking the question, would not necessarily translate well to another culture. So we really tried to empower our local communicators and local markets to really tailor that, but also keeping in mind that there is a meta narrative, a meta storytelling framework that we want to adhere to, but handle it the best you can. It's not a perfect science, but handle it the best you can in your local market.
Ken, you want to come in on this?
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Yes.
I'm sorry, I've lost audio. I don't know if you can hear me. I can't hear you.
Oh dear. Okay.
We can hear you.
It comes and goes, so proceed. I'll change Wi-Fi networks and see if that helps.
Okay.
I just wanted to highlight, if I may, that question came from our managing director in DC, Mohammed Barakat, and the question before that also came from our president, Ambassador Ann Patterson, on the press and discipline around that. So I just wanted to
thank you.
Share that.
Thank you very much. I'm intrigued still by this question about losing your job, losing your residence, your legal status for the expats community, I assume, that are working around the world for companies, global companies like MUFG, Coca-Cola, UPS. What is the responsibility of the company to reach out to folks who are, as he says, making a major impact on the psychology? That you're not only losing your job, but you're going to have to pack your kids up and go home.
Is that to me?
Either one, Tim or Steve, or if Ken can hear us. Tim?
Well, right. The entire question of legal status is going to be in some political domains a very tough call. And to the extent that there's even an attempt to communicate, often can be a great first step in acknowledging the situation when answers may be very difficult to come by.
Exactly. Steve, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, no, I don't think I really have much more to add there other than what Tim said. I do know that, and this just gets to, I think, everything that we've said before is, and June, you're a master at this, which is, even if you don't have the right answer necessarily, or you don't have all the data points in front of you, to what Tim just said, acknowledging the fact that and showing that empathy, realizing that people are going through it. There's a lot of anxiety going through, a lot of people, not just people worried about their physical health, but their economic health, and probably to some degree the mental health of themselves and their families. Just acknowledging that, I think, has a way of tempering folks and settling folks down to a certain degree. There are a lot of complicated issues, and I think most employees are sophisticated enough to know that so much is still unclear with the situation, that we are all of us are living kind of day to day to see what's going to happen as far as how we're going to dig out of this thing. So and I don't think everybody's necessarily expecting all the answers and 100% clarity, but just showing that empathy, being authentic, being real, saying, you know what, I don't have all the answers. June, you had a great example in your class yesterday. You had a student that gave an example of a CEO who was getting ready to announce layoffs and said, you have nobody to blame here but me. I mean, it was just, I thought, a really strong act of courageous leadership. I mean, it wasn't tongue in cheek. It was basically the CEO saying, I had to make this tough decision. It wasn't your boss. It wasn't your performance. It wasn't any other mitigating circumstances other than the crisis that we're going through and the fact that we need to do this to continue to run the business. But if you want to call anybody, if you want to, yell at anybody, give me a call. And I thought that was a fantastic example.
Yeah, from an academic viewpoint, over the years that I've been teaching, almost, I don't even want to say, but let's say a couple of 4 decades, audience analysis, and you guys have emphasized this throughout our conversation this morning, is what really gets in the way of good communication. People have not paid any attention to who their audience is. And the first thing that audiences want to know is, how is this going to affect me? First thing. So as all of you are saying, you want your purpose up, you want your objective. Why are we communicating? But then who are we communicating to? And their first question is, I'm going to lose my job. And you're an expat. Am I going to lose my house? And am I going to have to move back? That's what they want to know. And in the absence of information, people create information. And that's very important, that in the absence of information, people will create it. And that grapevine goes through the community very quickly now with social media, particularly, with all kinds of false narratives. And that's why the 3 of you have emphasized today the importance of consistent communication, the cascading of information, that what the C-suite is saying is what we're getting down at the frontline levels. And that's very important. The other mantra that I say to my students is, correcting mistakes in communication is costly business, costly. You need to get your communication strategy and planning up front when you're setting your strategy so that you avoid the kinds of mistakes. And the first mistakes people make are not paying attention to their audiences and who their key audiences are. So that's a really very important question.
June, if I could add one thing to that.
Yeah, please, Tim.
As you think about your audiences and you think about messaging, and you have that first draft of your 3 or 4 key messages that you really want to communicate broadly, test them. You may be able to test with a friendly investor, a key customer, some employees, or their proxies. But it's often a very good idea to take your first draft of messaging and then say, you know, how will people hear this? The great Boston Celtics basketball coach, Red Auerbach, used to like to say, it's not what I say that counts, it's what they hear that really counts. And so testing messages to make sure what you think people ought to be hearing is in fact what they are hearing is an important step in communications.
And that disconnect between the verbal and the nonverbal. So if you're saying something verbally, but non-verbally, you're not exuding that kind of empathy, people will believe the nonverbal over the verbal.
Correct.
That's what Ken was saying earlier, that you need to make sure who are you choosing to communicate. Another great question.
Yeah, we've got a bunch of bunch of questions piling up.
Come on, Amanda.
If I can actually, May sent me a question as well, and I think it's a nice transition actually of the conversation. So she's wondering, how should SMEs follow the same guidelines, or should they take a different approach? Is this all applicable for the smaller and medium enterprises? If you guys can comment on that, and we can jump into some others as well after that.
I'll pick up if that's okay. I think SMEs are probably are more critical right now than ever within organizations, and really need to be aligned with the communication strategy for the company. I also think it's a time, and the responsibility should be with the chief communication officer, the communication shop, or if it's a small shop and you're wearing multiple hats, whoever has got the communication piece needs to be reaching out to SMEs and getting them aligned on protocols, on messaging, on what their role is going to be. But I also think it's a time for SMEs, and I'm seeing it with a lot of clients I'm working with, who may not have considered themselves part of sort of the communication apparatus, raising their hands and say, use me, deploy me. You know, we're doing some really interesting things right now at, I'll just give an example, at Corteva AgriScience, to manufacture our own hand sanitizers. So they're really showing some really, because they have hand sanitizers are in shortage, not just on the consumer side, but on the B2B side. And it's critical, for these folks that are working on genetic research and biotechnology to have safe operating environments. So the companies take it upon themselves to do things like manufacture sanitizers. And so you're getting these subject matter experts who started these initiatives raising their hands, and all of a sudden they're the new face for the company to show innovation on the fly. So I think it's a critical, it's never been more critical for SMEs to be part of and be part of the communication apparatus here and be coordinated in their approach. And also, and those who aren't in the loop should be raising their hands if they feel like they have a contribution to make, because I think communication people would welcome any help they can get.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to move to John Kilmartin's question. Clients are receiving a lot of messaging from various sources at the moment. How do you decide the right level of communications, particularly in terms of frequency of client and then customer communications?
Excellent question. And I think cadence and timing is an important consideration. Right now, I think this very technology that we're using is going to be, or already is, making a major impact on people's ability to at least have face and voice connectivity where human contact isn't possible. But in terms of cadence, I think the ability to record webinars such as this, or record messaging, communication from leadership, and making it available so people can access it when they are able to access it is an important consideration. having it on a website or having it somehow accessible at a time and place when people can go get it is a way to make it not too imposing and let people take from it what they want when they want to. So we live in an age where technology, I think, allows consumers of communications a lot of options and a lot of flexibility to take it aboard as they can.
Tim, just to pick up on that and give a specific, I have a client I'm working with right now where the CEO will be sending out a weekly message to key customers, understanding that some customers want more detail, want a deeper dive, want more context. So they give them the option to opt in to more regular updates. You just basically hit a button, and those that want to opt in, to Tim's point, we have this great tool called technology that can allow the customer to dictate how much communication they want. So I think just offering them, or developing a platform that would just offer them that choice is a good innovative approach.
Thank you for that. I'm gonna move on to Fahad Kouari's comment. Apologies if there's noise in the background. A very fair point was made in emphasizing an entity's reputation and crisis response as the first lines in conveying security to clients and investors. What would you say comes thereafter when talking to investors and or clients?
I'm sorry, the first part of that question was, again, could you repeat?
It was more of a comment, but I'll read it again. A very fair point was made in emphasizing an entity's reputation and crisis response as the first lines in conveying security to the clients and the investors. What would you say? So what would you say comes thereafter when talking to investors and or clients?
I'm happy to pick up, unless Tim, do you have anything you want to jump in?
Well, if I understand the question, the way I hear the question is, how do you keep it going over time? And so one of the key failings that organizations have had in communicating is to think that just because they've said something once, that everybody understands it, and that the need to communicate additionally is no longer appropriate. Human nature would tell you that repetition is not something that comes naturally to us. But in communications, repetition is your friend. And being able to communicate the same key messages consistently and persistently over time, there are some studies which would suggest that someone needs to hear a message 4 or 5 or maybe 6 times before they fully really engage and absorb it. So if the question is about the longevity of communicating your messaging, it's till the crisis is over, and then even in the post-crisis environment, keeping it going a bit longer just to complete the cycle.
Yeah, and I would just pick up on, specifically in the investor space, and what I'm seeing right at this moment is, companies are first coming out, talking about the problems, talking about how they're currently managing through the crisis. But I think that segues, the trend line I'm seeing is a segue into, okay, what's next? The investor community always wants to know. I don't really care about how you're doing right now. I want to know how you're going to be doing next week or next month or 2 months or 2 years from now. So what is the planning? What have you learned that's adaptable into your business model moving forward? And what is the plan moving forward to, restart the business and to do it in a way that's going to, continue to generate value. So I think you got to quickly segue from, acknowledging the present, what you're doing to alleviate some of the pressures on the business, but then segue into a deep dive into what the plan is moving forward. And again, that's easier said than done because there are a lot of unknowns still. And I think that it gets back to that point. If, you also got to you can't bluff with these investors because they know more about the business than most CEOs do, quite frankly. And you just got to be straightforward. If you don't have all your your chips lined up, just acknowledge, there's still some things we're gonna have to work through. There's some unknowns, there's some contingencies. We don't know totally right now, but we're going to be monitoring this thing. And I think right now more than ever, optics matter. They want to see these earnings calls and these scripts and these press releases a lot of them are about optics. And do we have a smart, strategic, trustworthy leadership team in place? And I think a lot of CEOs, I think this is their Waterloo. This is a high water mark. This is their litmus test going through right now to engender trust and credibility, getting back to what Ken was saying from the onset.
Thank you. I think if I'll ask one more question from our Q&A, and then we'll turn it back to you, June, if you have any final questions for our panelists. But I'll ask one more from Aaron Teitelbaum from our office in DC. His question is, considering that these are unprecedented times, how do you set communications objectives or targets to different stakeholder groups? What ways do you employ to measure your impact?
Steve, I'd like to throw that to you with the current desired mindset.
Yeah, a lot of companies.
And then measurement.
Sure. Yeah. A lot of companies right now are using pulse surveys, spot surveys with employees, and those are easy to. I say they're easy. They're relatively easy to establish, and I think it's actually a really good time. That's one measurement, which is employee engagement. But you've got employees right now who are at home who are probably more likely to be engaged in even filling out a survey than they have been ever. So that's a simple but I think effective thing to really start gauging, what employee sentiment is at the time. The other thing I think is, for big brands, this isn't applicable to all companies. There's some companies that are kind of quiet that don't generate a lot of media attention, but for big brands that generate media attention, I would have Tim Beecher and the folks at Fleishman Hillard do a media analysis spot check on, is it positive, neutral, negative, and an analysis of what's driving that public sentiment. So I think really tracking your media sentiment right now is going to be critical. And then someone mentioned, we talked earlier about SMEs. I think SMEs and account executives right now are more critical than ever, and getting on the phone and having an infrastructure in place to gather data, anecdotal data from account executives and people who are out there interfacing with customers to get input from them as to to June's point, what that current mindset is. I think is absolutely critical. And June and I have talked about this, but I think that even though we're all sequestered in our homes right now, that face-to-face communication, if you will, that getting on the phone, talking to people, being on Zoom, video conference, et cetera, is more important than ever. And it's going to weed out a lot of managers. I think a lot of careers are going to be made and broken over the next few weeks. And we're going to see the cream rise to the top. We always do in crisis situations. But I think right now is the time to, that interpersonal part of communication is more important than ever.
To the point of pulse surveys, we do a tremendous amount of pulse surveys, but actually we have to be mindful of fatigue, polling fatigue. So we make a point of monitoring how responsive people are. When the response percentage starts to go down, we realize that we need to take our foot off the pedal. We also are very careful to make these pulse surveys extremely short. I mean, something that people can respond to in 30 seconds. I mean, not a bunch of questions and requests for essays, just 3 questions maybe. So very simplicity.
Thank you. Dr. West, we'll turn it over to you.
Just to finish up on the idea of this desired, Ken and I teach a class at Darden on communicating during disruption and transformation. And this issue, it's very important in terms of audience analysis and listing out your stakeholders, each and every stakeholder, and what is their current mindset today? Where do you want them to go? And then how do you craft a message to get folks from that, from their current state to where you want it to be? It's almost today a daily thing. Tim, Steve, Ken, I think we're going to end this. We're not at the noon hour. Just in a real lightning rod, can I ask you, what are some of your parting thoughts on what's useful that we're seeing in C-suite communication and useless? Tim, I think this was your depiction of some of the stuff that all of us are getting bombarded in our email boxes from every company, our frequent flyers, our frequent hotels, whatever. And Tim, you said a couple of weeks ago, some of it's useful, some of it's useless. So can we get a lightning rod from each of you? Useful, useless.
Useful is the high empathy. We care about our people, trying to figure out what we're going to do, but we're working the problem, but we're all in this together. Highly useful to me. Whether or not my frequent flyer points or frequent stay points are going to be there this week, next week, or whatever is absolutely useless to me.
Yeah, I echo that. Useful, I think, showing that the wheels of commerce are in motion as much as possible. You know, and I think about the US-Qatar Business Council. If I was a member of the council or just as a citizen of the United States, knowing that businesses and government officials and NGOs across Qatar and the United States and throughout the Gulf region in the US are actively engaged in discussions about moving their businesses forward, moving their economies forward. I personally I find that extremely gratifying and good to hear. We've started hearing some announcements here in the US about regional governors getting together and other officials, and it just makes me feel like, okay, someone's got their hand on the wheel. Useless is exactly what Ken said. Don't sell me anything right now.
Yeah, right.
Don't even try to sell me anything. Yeah. I'm not interested.
To me, useless is
breaking up, Ken. We'll have to get Ken to put that in writing for us, and maybe Amanda can send it out. Well, thank you, Ken and Tim and Steve. And I want to thank all of our audience today for spending an hour with us. That's a lot of time out of your day. We appreciate it, particularly those of you in the Gulf region where it's now quite late. I want to thank Ms. Althani and Amanda, Ms. Shetty, and the US-Qatar Business Council for the kind invitation for us to share some of our insights in this very troubling time. And I know all the panelists, we wish everyone to be safe and to your families, and that you all are well. And perhaps we'll have many more of these in the time to come. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you, June.
Thanks.